Imagine smoking a cigar inside a flying bomb filled with 7 million cubic feet of explosive hydrogen. Welcome aboard the Hindenburg. Long before you squeezed into seat 32B with your knees against your chest, air travel looked nothing like today. In the 1930s, crossing the Atlantic meant something entirely different. It meant floating through the clouds in a palace made of aluminum and silk, dining on lobster with crystal wine glasses, while the ocean drifted silently 200 meters below your open window. This was the Hindenburg, the largest aircraft ever to fly, and for 14 glorious months it represented humanity's most ambitious dream, to conquer the sky not with speed and efficiency, but with elegance and grace. But that dream died in 37 seconds of fire on May 6, 1937. The question is not just what happened that day in New Jersey. The question is why we built flying hotels suspended by the most dangerous gas on Earth, and why, after the Hindenburg burned, we never tried again. This is the story of the most luxurious way to travel that ever existed, and the tragedy that killed it forever. Before the Hindenburg, crossing the Atlantic Ocean was an ordeal of patience. The great ocean liners like the Titanic, the Mauretania, and the Queen Mary ruled the waves, carrying passengers in opulent first-class cabins with grand staircases, ballrooms, and dining halls that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. But even these floating palaces had one insurmountable problem: time. A transatlantic voyage took 5 to 7 days, sometimes longer if storms delayed the journey. For businessmen, diplomats, and the wealthy elite who needed to move between continents, this was an eternity. The dream of faster travel had existed since the Wright brothers first lifted off at Kitty Hawk in 1903. But early airplanes were fragile, dangerous contraptions that could barely carry a pilot, let alone passengers and luggage. They were loud, uncomfortable, and terrifying. No one in their right mind would cross an ocean in one. But there was another way to fly, one that seemed far more promising in the early 20th century: lighter-than-air travel. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a retired German cavalry officer, had been obsessed with this idea since the 1890s. He envisioned massive rigid airships, held aloft by enormous gas-filled cells, powered by engines, and capable of carrying passengers in comfort across vast distances. His first successful flight came in 1900 with the LZ-1, and over the next 2 decades he refined his designs. By World War I, German Zeppelins were being used as military bombers, floating silently over London and Paris, dropping explosives from altitudes that made them nearly untouchable. The psychological impact of these raids cannot be overstated. Londoners would hear the distant hum of engines in the night sky, and then the explosions would begin. There was something uniquely terrifying about an enemy that attacked from above, invisible in the darkness, unreachable by ground defenses. The Zeppelin raids killed relatively few people compared to later aerial bombardments, but they shattered the illusion of safety. The sky was no longer a neutral space. It had become a battlefield. After the war, Germany was forbidden from building military aircraft, but civilian airships were allowed. The Germans pivoted quickly. If they could not dominate the skies with weapons, they would dominate them with luxury. In 1928, the Graf Zeppelin completed its first transatlantic crossing, and suddenly, the future seemed clear. Airships could cross the ocean in 2 to 3 days, half the time of the fastest ocean liner, and they could do it smoothly, floating above the weather, above the waves, in near silence. The Graf Zeppelin became a celebrity in its own right. It completed 590 flights, carried over 13,000 passengers, and traveled more than 1 million miles without a single passenger injury. It circumnavigated the globe in 1929, a journey that took just 21 days and captured the imagination of the entire world. Newspapers covered every leg of the journey. Crowds gathered at every stop to see the massive airship. The Graf Zeppelin proved that airship travel was not just possible, but practical and safe. By the early 1930s, the Graf Zeppelin had completed dozens of successful flights, including a round-the-world journey that captured global headlines. Passengers raved about the experience. There was no turbulence, no seasickness. just a gentle glide through the sky. The cabins were small but comfortable, the food was excellent, and the views were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Standing at a window and watching the Atlantic Ocean pass beneath you, watching icebergs drift in the North Atlantic, watching the lights of New York City appear on the horizon, this was magic. Germany wanted more. They wanted to build the ultimate airship, one that would cement their dominance in transatlantic travel and showcase German engineering to the world. The result was the Hindenburg, and when it launched in 1936, it was the largest flying object ever built. The numbers are staggering. The Hindenburg measured 804 feet long, just slightly shorter than the Titanic's 882 feet. If you stood it on its tail, it would be taller than an 80-story skyscraper. Its maximum diameter was 135 feet, roughly the width of a 13-story building laid on its side. Inside its massive frame were 16 gas cells, each one a separate balloon made of gold beater's skin, a material derived from the intestines of cattle. These cells held 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas, giving the Hindenburg enough lift to carry 10,000 kilograms of payload, including passengers, crew, luggage, fuel, and supplies. The construction of the Hindenburg took place in Friedrichshafen, Germany, in a massive hangar that was itself an engineering marvel. The hangar was so large that clouds would sometimes form inside it on humid days. Workers assembled the airship piece by piece, riveting together thousands of duralumin girders to create the skeleton. The work was meticulous and dangerous. Men worked at dizzying heights, balancing on narrow catwalks, connecting the framework that would hold the gas cells and support the passenger compartments. The frame itself was a masterpiece of engineering. It was constructed from duralumin, a lightweight aluminum alloy that was strong enough to support the structure, but light enough to allow flight. The entire skeleton weighed only 130 tons, an astonishing feat considering its size. Every single component was designed with weight in mind. The engineers obsessed over grams. They used aluminum furniture, lightweight fabrics, and even designed a piano made entirely of aluminum and covered in pigskin to save weight. The outer covering of the Hindenburg was made of cotton fabric, tightly stretched over the frame and painted with a special doping compound. This compound, a mixture of cellulose acetate butyrate, aluminum powder, and iron oxide, was designed to protect the fabric from weather, reflect heat, and reduce UV damage. The fabric was applied in sections, each one carefully sewn and glued to create a smooth aerodynamic surface. When complete, the Hindenburg's skin was taut and silvery, reflecting sunlight like a mirror. 4 1,200 horsepower diesel engines, mounted in gondolas on either side of the hull, powered the Hindenburg. Diesel was chosen instead of gasoline because it was less flammable, a critical consideration when your entire aircraft is filled with explosive hydrogen. The engines could push the airship to a maximum speed of 84 miles per hour, though cruising speed was typically around 78 miles per hour. This was not fast by airplane standards, but it was more than twice as fast as an ocean liner. Each engine gondola was accessible from inside the hull via a narrow ladder and tunnel. Engineers would climb down during flight to perform maintenance, check oil levels, and monitor engine performance. The noise inside the gondolas was deafening, and the heat from the engines was intense. It was grueling work, but essential. The engines had to run flawlessly for the entire journey, and the engineers took pride in their reliability. The Hindenburg made its maiden voyage on March 4, 1936, flying from Friedrichshafen, Germany, to Lakehurst, New Jersey. The flight took just over 60 hours, and it was a triumph. Passengers disembarked raving about the experience, and newspapers around the world covered the event with breathless excitement. Over the course of 1936, the Hindenburg completed 10 round trips across the Atlantic, carrying a total of 1,002 passengers without a single injury. It also made 7 round trips to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The airship was a commercial success, and bookings for the 1937 season were strong. But the Hindenburg was more than just a technological achievement. It was a propaganda tool. The Nazi regime, which had come to power in 1933, saw the airship as a symbol of German superiority. Enormous swastika flags were painted on the tail fins, visible for miles. The Hindenburg was used for propaganda flights over Germany, broadcasting speeches and dropping leaflets. It flew over the 1936 Berlin Olympics, a spectacle designed to showcase Nazi power to the world. For the regime, the Hindenburg was not just an airship. It was a statement. The propaganda flights were elaborate affairs. The Hindenburg would fly low over German cities, sometimes accompanied by the Graf Zeppelin, creating a formation that awed spectators below. Loudspeakers mounted on the gondolas would broadcast patriotic music and speeches by Nazi officials. Leaflets would flutter down, urging citizens to vote in favor of Nazi policies in upcoming referendums. The sight of the massive airship, adorned with swastikas floating majestically overhead, was designed to inspire feelings of national pride and technological superiority. Now let's step inside. Forget everything you know about modern air travel. Forget the cramped seats, the recycled air, the tiny bathrooms, the crying babies, the overhead bins stuffed with luggage. The Hindenburg was nothing like that. Boarding the airship was like checking into a luxury hotel, except this hotel could fly. Passengers entered through a retractable stairway that led into the lower deck, known as B deck. The first thing you noticed was space. The central corridor ran nearly 100 feet through the center of the passenger area, with cabins on either side. The walls were covered in lightweight fabric painted in soft, neutral tones. The floors were padded to reduce noise. Everything was designed to feel calm, elegant, and comfortable. There were 25 passenger cabins, each one a private room with 2 sleeping berths, one upper and one lower, that folded up during the day to create a small sitting area. The cabins were not large, about 78 square feet, roughly the size of a small bedroom, but they were far more spacious than anything you would find on an airplane. Each cabin had a small wash basin with hot and cold running water, a luxury that even many homes in the 1930s did not have. There was a closet for clothes, a small writing desk, and a window. The windows were large, offering panoramic views of the sky and the earth below. The beds were comfortable, with real mattresses, pillows, and blankets. At night, stewards would convert the cabins from sitting rooms to bedrooms, pulling down the upper berth and making the beds with fresh linens. In the morning, they would reverse the process. It was like staying in a sleeper train, but quieter, smoother, and with better views. Passengers would often spend time in their cabins reading, writing letters, or simply gazing out the windows. The view was constantly changing. During the day, you might see the patchwork of farmland in Germany, the rugged coastline of Ireland, the vast emptiness of the Atlantic, or the fishing boats of Newfoundland. At night, you might see the lights of ships far below, the glow of distant cities on the horizon, or simply the stars, more brilliant than most people had ever seen them. The real luxury, however, was in the public spaces. On B deck, on the starboard side, was the dining room. It could seat 34 passengers at a time, which meant 2 seatings for meals when the airship was fully booked. The tables were set with fine porcelain plates, crystal glassware, and silver cutlery. The chairs were lightweight but elegantly designed, upholstered in fabric. Large windows lined the walls, offering uninterrupted views of the ocean or countryside below. The food was extraordinary. The Hindenburg employed skilled chefs who prepared multi-course meals in a fully equipped galley kitchen. Breakfast might include fresh fruit, eggs, sausages, pastries, and coffee. Lunch could be a salad, soup, fish, and dessert. Dinner was the main event. Appetizers, a choice of entrees such as roast duck, beef tenderloin or lobster, vegetables, potatoes, and elaborate desserts. Wine, champagne, and cocktails were available. The meals were served on fine china, and the presentation was impeccable. The galley kitchen was a marvel of compact efficiency. Space was at a premium, so every inch was carefully designed. There were electric stoves, ovens, refrigerators, and storage for provisions. The chefs worked in cramped conditions, but they produced meals that would have been at home in the finest restaurants in Europe. Fresh ingredients were loaded before each flight, and the menu changed regularly to keep passengers interested on longer journeys. Imagine sitting at a table, a glass of German Riesling in your hand, cutting into a perfectly cooked steak, while outside your window the Atlantic Ocean stretches to the horizon, and you are floating 200 meters above it, moving at 80 miles per hour in near silence. This was not just travel. This was an experience. Above the dining room, on A deck, was the lounge, and this was the crown jewel of the Hindenburg. The lounge was 47 feet long, with large windows on both sides that slanted outward and downward, giving passengers a view not just to the sides, but below the airship. The windows could be opened, a feature that seems insane by modern standards but was one of the most beloved aspects of the Hindenburg. Passengers could lean out and feel the wind, smell the ocean air, and experience the sensation of flight in a way that no one in a modern airplane ever could. The furniture in the lounge was lightweight but stylish, designed by Fritz August Breuhaus, one of Germany's leading interior designers. There were chairs, sofas, and small tables where passengers could sit, read, play cards, or simply talk. The walls were decorated with paintings and maps. There was a small library with books and magazines, and in the corner there was the piano. The piano was a marvel. It was a Bluthner Baby Grand, but it had been specially constructed from aluminum and covered in yellow pigskin to reduce weight. A normal baby grand piano weighs around 500 pounds. This one weighed just 356 pounds. Passengers could play it, or sometimes a crew member who knew how to play would perform in the evenings. The sound of a piano echoing through the lounge while the sun set outside the windows became one of the most iconic memories of Hindenburg passengers. One passenger, Margaret Mather, an American returning from Europe in 1936, later wrote about her experience in the lounge. She described sitting by the window as the Hindenburg crossed the Irish coast at sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and below, she could see the green hills and rocky cliffs of Ireland. Someone was playing Chopin on the piano, and the other passengers were quietly talking or reading. She wrote that it was the most peaceful, beautiful moment of her life, a memory she would treasure forever. But the most audacious feature of the Hindenburg was the smoking room. Yes, you read that correctly. There was a smoking room on an airship filled with 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen, the most flammable substance in the universe. This was either a triumph of engineering or absolute madness, depending on how you look at it. The smoking room was located on B deck, on the port side, directly across from the dining room. It was small, about 10 feet by 13 feet, and it was sealed off from the rest of the airship with a double-door airlock. The room was pressurized to a slightly higher pressure than the rest of the ship, which meant that if there were any leaks, air would flow out of the smoking room, not into it, preventing hydrogen from entering. The walls were lined with asbestos for fire protection. Inside, there was one electric lighter built into the wall. Passengers were not allowed to bring matches or their own lighters. A steward was stationed at the door at all times to ensure no one tried to sneak in contraband. The room had a small bar where passengers could order drinks, and there were a few chairs and ashtrays. Smoking a cigar in that room, knowing that just a few meters away, separated by fabric and a thin layer of asbestos, was enough hydrogen to level a city block, must have been one of the most thrilling and terrifying experiences imaginable. The steward assigned to the smoking room had one of the most important jobs on the airship. He would search passengers as they entered, checking pockets and bags for matches or lighters. He would watch them carefully while they smoked, making sure no one did anything foolish. And he would ensure that every cigarette and cigar was completely extinguished before passengers left. It was a job that required constant vigilance, and the stewards took it seriously. They knew that one mistake could kill everyone aboard. Beyond the public rooms, there were other amenities. There were washrooms with hot showers, a luxury that even first-class ocean liner passengers sometimes had to do without. There was a writing room with stationery embossed with the Hindenburg logo, where passengers could write letters and postcards that would be postmarked with a special Hindenburg stamp. There was even a small infirmary with a doctor on board in case of medical emergencies. The crew quarters were more Spartan, but still comfortable. The Hindenburg carried a crew of 40 to 61 people, depending on the flight, including the captain, officers, engineers, stewards, cooks, and riggers. The riggers were crew members who climbed inside the hull, walking along catwalks between the gas cells, inspecting for leaks and making repairs. It was dangerous work, done in near darkness, surrounded by hydrogen. The riggers wore special shoes with soft soles to prevent sparks. They carried flashlights with protective casings. They moved carefully, testing each step, because a fall from the catwalks could be fatal. Their job was to inspect the gas cells for leaks, check the tension of the wires that held the cells in place, and look for any signs of structural damage. They would sniff the air, searching for the distinctive smell of hydrogen, which had been mixed with a small amount of garlic-scented additive to make leaks detectable. The experience of flying on the Hindenburg was unlike anything else. The ride was smooth, almost eerily so. There was no turbulence because the airship floated above most weather. There was no engine noise in the passenger areas because the engines were mounted far away in external gondolas. The only sound was a faint hum, a gentle vibration, and the occasional creak of the aluminum frame. Passengers described it as floating on a cloud. During the day, passengers would gather in the lounge, watching the world pass below. They would see ships on the ocean, icebergs in the North Atlantic, whales breaching, fishing villages on the coast of Newfoundland, and eventually, the skyline of New York City rising in the distance. At night, they would watch the stars, unobstructed by city lights brighter and more numerous than most people had ever seen. One passenger, Leonhard Adelt, a German journalist, flew on the final voyage of the Hindenburg with his wife. Before the disaster, he wrote notes about the experience, describing the sensation of watching the sun rise from the lounge. He wrote that the sun appeared slowly over the horizon, painting the clouds below in shades of gold and crimson. The ocean was calm, reflecting the colors of the sky. He felt as though he was suspended between heaven and earth, floating in a space that belonged to neither. It was, he wrote, like being in a dream. Meals were social events. Passengers, who were typically wealthy businessmen, aristocrats, celebrities, and adventurers, would dine together, share stories, and form friendships. There was a sense of camaraderie, a shared experience of being part of something extraordinary. The crew was attentive and professional, trained in the finest traditions of German hospitality. The journey from Germany to the United States took about 2.5 days, depending on winds. It was not fast by modern standards, but it was twice as fast as a ship, and infinitely more comfortable than the cramped, noisy airplanes of the era. For the passengers, the journey was not something to be endured. It was something to be savored. A ticket on the Hindenburg cost $400 for a one-way trip from Germany to the United States, which is equivalent to about $8,000 to $10,000 in today's money. This was expensive, but not outrageous for the wealthy elite who could afford it. It was comparable to a first-class ticket on an ocean liner, but you arrived in half the time. For businessmen who valued speed, or for adventurers who wanted to experience the thrill of airship travel, it was worth every penny. The passengers came from all walks of the upper class. There were American businessmen returning from meetings in Europe, German diplomats traveling to the United States, journalists covering the new technology, and wealthy tourists who simply wanted to say they had flown on the Hindenburg. Some passengers were repeat customers, flying multiple times because they loved the experience so much. Among the passengers on various flights were notable figures. Nelson Morris, a wealthy Chicago meatpacking heir, flew on the Hindenburg multiple times and became one of its most enthusiastic advocates. Douglas Robinson, a nephew of President Theodore Roosevelt, flew in 1936 and wrote glowing accounts of the experience for American newspapers. There were European aristocrats, Hollywood producers scouting locations, and even a few honeymooning couples who wanted to start their marriages with an unforgettable journey. The crew was led by Captain Max Pruss, a veteran airship pilot with years of experience. He had flown on the Graf Zeppelin and had been part of the Hindenburg's crew since its maiden voyage. He was known for his calm demeanor, his professionalism, and his deep knowledge of airship operations. Under his command were officers who navigated, engineers who monitored the engines and gas cells, stewards who served meals and attended to passengers, and riggers who maintained the airship's structure. Captain Pruss was a perfectionist. He insisted on thorough pre-flight inspections, regular crew training, and strict adherence to safety protocols. He had flown thousands of hours on airships and had never had a serious accident. His crew respected him, and passengers felt safe under his command. He represented the best of German aviation, a combination of technical expertise, discipline, and professionalism. The culture aboard the Hindenburg was one of precision and discipline. The crew took their jobs seriously. They knew they were operating the most advanced aircraft in the world, and they knew the risks. Hydrogen was dangerous, and everyone aboard was trained in safety procedures. There were strict rules. No smoking outside the smoking room. No open flames. No static electricity. The crew conducted regular inspections, checking for leaks, monitoring gas pressure, and ensuring that every system was functioning perfectly. But despite all the precautions, despite all the engineering brilliance, despite all the successful flights, there was always a shadow hanging over the Hindenburg. That shadow was hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe, which makes it perfect for lifting airships. It is 14 times lighter than air, which means that a balloon filled with hydrogen will rise with tremendous force. But hydrogen has one catastrophic flaw. It is incredibly flammable. When mixed with oxygen, it becomes explosive. A single spark can ignite it, and once it starts burning, it is almost impossible to stop. The Germans knew this. Everyone knew this. The question was, why did they use hydrogen instead of helium? Helium is also lighter than air, though not quite as light as hydrogen, and it has one enormous advantage. It is completely inert. It does not burn. It does not explode. It is perfectly safe. American airships like the USS Macon and the USS Akron used helium, and while those airships had their own problems, fire was not one of them. The answer is politics. In the 1930s, the United States controlled almost the entire world's supply of helium. It was extracted from natural gas fields in Texas and Kansas, and the U.S. government tightly controlled its export. In 1927, Congress passed the Helium Control Act, which prohibited the export of helium to foreign countries. The official reason was national security. Helium was valuable for military airships, and the U.S. did not want to give it to potential enemies. Germany requested helium for the Hindenburg, but the request was denied. The U.S. government, wary of the Nazi regime and concerned about the possibility of war, refused to sell helium to Germany. There were negotiations, discussions, and diplomatic efforts, but ultimately the answer was no. The Germans had no choice. If they wanted to build airships, they had to use hydrogen. And so they did, knowing full well the risks. Some German engineers argued that hydrogen could be used safely if proper precautions were taken. They pointed to the Graf Zeppelin's perfect safety record. They designed elaborate safety systems, ventilation protocols, and fire prevention measures. They convinced themselves that the risk was manageable, but deep down, many of them knew the truth. They were flying a bomb, and it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. The Hindenburg was not the first airship to crash, and it would not be the last. The history of airships in the 1920s and 1930s is littered with disasters. In 1925, the USS Shenandoah, an American airship, broke apart in a storm over Ohio, killing 14 people. In 1930, the British R-101 crashed in France on its maiden voyage to India, killing 48 people. In 1933, the USS Akron crashed into the Atlantic Ocean during a storm, killing 73 people, the deadliest airship disaster in history. In 1935, the USS Macon broke apart over the Pacific Ocean, killing 2 people. These disasters were caused by structural failures, storms, and human error, not by fire. But they created a sense of unease. Airships were dangerous, they were fragile, they were at the mercy of the weather. And yet, the Hindenburg seemed different. It was larger, more advanced, more carefully designed. It had completed dozens of flights without incident. The Germans believed they had solved the problems that plagued earlier airships. They believed they had mastered the technology. They were wrong. On May 3, 1937, the Hindenburg departed from Frankfurt, Germany, on what was supposed to be a routine transatlantic flight to Lakehurst, New Jersey. There were 36 passengers aboard, far fewer than the airship's capacity of 72, and 61 crew members. The passengers included families, businessmen, and a few journalists. The mood was relaxed. Many of the passengers were repeat customers who had flown on the Hindenburg before. They knew what to expect: a smooth, comfortable journey, excellent food, and stunning views. Among the passengers were Leon Hardadelt and his wife Gertrude, both journalists. There was Joseph Spa, an acrobat and comedian traveling to New York for work. There was Herman Döner, a Mexican businessman, traveling with his wife and 3 children. There were newlyweds, elderly couples, and solo travelers. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, but they all shared the excitement of flying on the Hindenburg. The flight across the Atlantic was uneventful. The weather was good, the engines ran smoothly, and the passengers enjoyed their meals, played cards in the lounge, and watched the ocean pass below. On the evening of May 6th, the Hindenburg approached the New Jersey coast. The plan was to land at Lakehurst Naval Air Station, where a mooring mast and ground crew were waiting. But there was a problem. Thunderstorms were moving through the area, and Captain Pruss decided to delay the landing. The Hindenburg circled over the Atlantic, waiting for the weather to clear. This was standard procedure. Airships could not land in high winds or storms, so delays were common. The passengers were informed of the delay, and they continued to relax in the lounge, unaware that anything was wrong. By 7 p.m., the weather had improved enough for landing. Captain Pruss brought the Hindenburg in low over the airfield, and at 7:21 p.m., the landing ropes were dropped to the ground crew. 200 men grabbed the ropes and began pulling the airship toward the mooring mast. Everything seemed normal. The passengers were gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. Some were standing at the windows, waving to the crowd of spectators who had gathered to watch the landing. And then, at 7:25 p.m., someone on the ground noticed a small flame near the tail of the airship. Within seconds, the flame grew. The hydrogen in the aft gas cells ignited, and the entire tail section erupted in fire. The flames raced forward along the length of the airship, consuming the hydrogen in cell after cell. The Hindenburg's nose tilted upward as the tail collapsed, and then the entire structure came crashing down. It took 37 seconds from the first flame to the moment the Hindenburg hit the ground. 37 seconds. In that time, the largest aircraft ever built was reduced to a twisted, burning skeleton. Passengers and crew scrambled to escape. Some jumped from windows before the airship hit the ground. Others ran through the flames as the structure collapsed around them. The heat was so intense that metal melted. The fabric covering the airship disintegrated. The hydrogen burned with a roar that could be heard for miles. Werner Franz, a 14-year-old cabin boy, was in the crew quarters when the fire started. He felt the airship lurch, heard screams, and saw flames. A water tank above him burst, drenching him with water. That water saved his life. He ran through the flames, his wet clothes protecting him from the heat, and jumped from a window as the airship hit the ground. He survived with minor injuries. Joseph Spey, the acrobat, was in his cabin when the fire started. He ran to a window, saw that the ground was still too far to jump, and hung from the window frame by his hands, waiting for the airship to descend. When it was low enough, he dropped and ran. He survived. Herman Döner and his family were not so lucky. Herman, his wife, and their 3 children were in the dining room when the fire started. Herman and 2 of his children survived, but his wife and youngest son died in the flames. Herbert Morrison, a radio reporter who was covering the landing, captured the disaster in real time. His voice, choked with emotion, became one of the most famous recordings in history. "It's burst into flames. Get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling. Oh, the humanity." When the flames finally died down, 35 people were dead. 13 passengers, 22 crew members, and 1 member of the ground crew. 62 people survived, many of them with severe burns. The fact that anyone survived at all is remarkable. Some passengers were able to jump from the airship before it hit the ground. Others were thrown clear when the structure collapsed. A few walked out of the wreckage, dazed but alive. Captain Max Pruss survived, but he was severely burned. He spent months in the hospital recovering. He never flew again. For the rest of his life, he carried the guilt of the disaster, even though it was not his fault. The wreckage of the Hindenburg lay smoldering on the ground, a twisted mass of metal and ash. Investigators arrived within hours, and the world waited for answers. What had caused the disaster? Was it sabotage? Was it a structural failure? Was it lightning? The investigation took months. The most widely accepted theory is that a combination of factors caused the fire. The Hindenburg had been flying through stormy weather, and the airship's fabric covering had likely built up a static electrical charge. When the landing ropes were dropped, they grounded the frame of the airship, but the fabric remained charged. A spark, possibly caused by a difference in electrical potential between the fabric and the frame, ignited leaking hydrogen near the tail. Another factor was the fabric itself. The Hindenburg's outer covering was made of cotton doped with a mixture of cellulose acetate, aluminum powder, and iron oxide. This coating was designed to protect the fabric from weather and UV damage, but it was also highly flammable. Some researchers believe that the fabric, not the hydrogen, was the primary fuel for the fire. The hydrogen burned quickly and rose upward, but the fabric burned intensely and spread the fire along the length of the airship. There were also theories of sabotage. Some believed that a bomb had been planted aboard the airship, possibly by someone opposed to the Nazi regime. But no evidence of sabotage was ever found, and most historians believe the disaster was an accident, a tragic combination of design flaws, weather conditions, and bad luck. The Hindenburg disaster was not the deadliest airship crash in history. The USS Akron disaster in 1933 killed 73 people, far more than the Hindenburg. But the Hindenburg disaster was different. It was captured on film. Newsreel cameras recorded the entire event, and the footage was shown in movie theaters around the world. Millions of people saw the Hindenburg burn. They heard Herbert Morrison's anguished voice. They saw the flames, the collapsing structure, the people running for their lives. The psychological impact was devastating. The image of the Hindenburg in flames became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It was proof, undeniable and horrifying, that airships were not safe. It did not matter that the Hindenburg had completed dozens of successful flights. It did not matter that other airships had flown for years without incident. The public saw the fire, and they made up their minds. Airships were death traps. Within days of the disaster, all passenger airship flights were suspended. The Graf Zeppelin, which had been flying successfully for nearly a decade, was grounded. Plans for new airships were canceled. The era of passenger airships was over, killed not by statistics or engineering analysis, but by fear. But the Hindenburg disaster was not the only reason airships disappeared. Timing played a role. In 1937, airplanes were rapidly improving. The Douglas DC-3, which entered service in 1936, could carry 21 passengers at speeds of up to 200 miles per hour. It was faster than any airship, and while it was not as comfortable, it was far cheaper to operate. Airlines were expanding, building networks of routes across the United States and Europe. The future of aviation was clearly going to be airplanes, not airships. World War II accelerated this trend. During the war, airplane technology advanced at an incredible pace. By 1945, planes like the Douglas DC-4 and the Lockheed Constellation could carry 50 to 80 passengers across the Atlantic at speeds of 300 miles per hour. After the war, these planes were converted to civilian use, and the age of commercial aviation began in earnest. By the 1950s, jet airliners like the Boeing 707 could carry hundreds of passengers at 500 miles per hour. Airships could not compete. There was also the helium problem. Even if airships had continued to develop, Germany would never have had access to helium. The United States controlled the supply, and after World War II, helium remained tightly controlled. Without helium, hydrogen airships were simply too dangerous. No one was willing to take the risk. And so, airships faded into history. A few blimps, Small, non-rigid airships continued to be used for advertising and surveillance, but the age of giant passenger airships was over. The Hindenburg was the last of its kind. What did we lose when the Hindenburg burned? We lost the experience of slow, luxurious air travel. We lost the ability to float through the sky, to open a window and feel the wind, to dine on fine china while watching the ocean pass below. We lost the romance of multi-day journeys where the journey itself was the destination. We lost the architectural beauty of airships, those massive, graceful structures that looked like something out of a dream. What did we gain? We gained speed. We gained efficiency. We gained accessibility. Today, millions of people fly every day, traveling distances in hours that would have taken weeks a century ago. Air travel has been democratized. A ticket from New York to London costs a few $100s, not thousands. You can fly across the Atlantic in 7 hours, not 2.5 days. The world has become smaller, more connected, more accessible. But we also gained something less tangible, a cautionary tale. The Hindenburg is a reminder of the dangers of hubris, of pushing technology to its limits without fully understanding the risks. It is a reminder that progress is not always linear, that sometimes we take a step forward and 2 steps back. It is a reminder that safety matters, that lives matter, and that no amount of luxury or elegance is worth the risk of catastrophe. The Hindenburg endures in our collective memory not just as a disaster, but as a symbol. It represents a lost future, a path not taken, a world where we chose speed over experience, efficiency over elegance. It represents the tension between ambition and caution, between the desire to push boundaries and the need to protect lives. Today, there are occasional proposals to revive passenger airships. Modern designs would use helium, not hydrogen, and would incorporate advanced materials and safety systems. Some companies have built prototype cargo airships designed to carry heavy loads to remote areas without runways. There is talk of luxury airship cruises, floating hotels that would take passengers on slow, scenic journeys over exotic landscapes. But none of these proposals have come to fruition. The ghost of the Hindenburg still haunts the industry. The public memory of that burning airship is too strong, too visceral. No one wants to be the first to try again. The insurance costs would be astronomical. The regulatory hurdles would be immense. And there is always the question, why? Airplanes are faster, cheaper, and proven. Why take the risk? And so, the Hindenburg remains frozen in time, a relic of a brief and extraordinary era. For 14 months, from March 1936 to May 1937, humanity flew in palaces. We floated through the clouds in luxury, dining on lobster, playing pianos made of aluminum, smoking cigars in pressurized rooms surrounded by explosive gas. We defied gravity with grace and elegance. And then, in 37 seconds, it all came crashing down. The Hindenburg was more luxurious than the Titanic, more ambitious than any aircraft before or since, and more tragic in its ending. It was a flying palace, a technological marvel, and a cautionary tale. It was the pinnacle of what airships could be and the reason they never were again. They did not just fly. They floated with the elegance of a lost era, a dream that burned away in the skies over New Jersey, leaving behind only memories, photographs, and the eternal question, what if? If you found this journey into the lost world of luxury air travel fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a like if you'd fly on the Hindenburg, and drop a comment below. Would you trade today's speed for yesterday's elegance? Thanks for watching.